Good morning. My name is Kyle Matthews. I'm Executive Director of the Montreal Institute for Global Security. We're very pleased here today to be at the Parliament of Canada for the Canadian launch of the 2026 Global Terrorism Index. The Global Terrorism Index is the most in-depth report on how terrorism is changing across the world, which countries are being impacted by it, and what are the ideological motivating factors behind some of these violent acts. I would just like to say is that Canada in the past year or past 2 years, we've seen increasing violent rhetoric in Canada. We've had increased security incidents, people arrested or stopped for engaging in violent action that's considered terrorism. We've seen increased targeting also anti-Semitic violence in Canada. So this is not an issue that is outside of Canada. We're connected to global crises, and what happens abroad has an impact directly at home. I'd also like to say is that we've seen also in the past year, terrorist groups can launch violent attacks against other countries that leads to wars and conflicts. We saw that particularly terrorist groups attacking civilians in India that led to a conflict between India and Pakistan. So this is also an important aspect. If we want to prevent conflicts, we have to kind of look at how violent extremist groups can carry out violent attacks and shape these narratives. In 2026, Canada, we're preoccupied with many security issues. We're preoccupied with the U.S.-Canada relationship. We're preoccupied with the war in the Middle East, particularly in Iran. But we also have to keep an eye on terrorist actors who are expanding. They're geographically expanding in Africa and other areas. So this is a primordial foreign policy issue, it's a security issue, and a national security issue for Canada. With that being said, I'd now like to turn the floor and ask my colleague Michael Collins of the Institute for Economic and Peace to talk about this year's Global Terrorism Index.
Thank you very much, Kyle, and good morning, everyone. The Global Terrorism Index basically looks into terrorist deaths, incidences, kidnappings and hostages worldwide by different terrorist groups, and looks at those over time. So we track differences from prior years, we track differences over the last decade, and we overlay that with geopolitical aspects and dynamics to be able to understand not only some of the drivers of terrorism around the world, but how those trends are changing over time. So overall, we saw a reduction in the number of terrorist deaths last year by about 20% in the number of terrorist incidences as well. In fact, if we look at the countries improving, we see that there over 4 times more countries have improved in some of the terrorism metrics than countries that deteriorated. So on the face of it, we see a reduction of terrorism worldwide. At the same time, there are a number of concerning trends. Most concretely for the West, a 280% increase in the number of deaths in the West in particular. We also see, for example, an increasing number of high-profile attacks. The Bondi Beach attack in Australia is an example of that. The New Orleans attack on New Year's Day in the US is another example of that. Overall, 57 deaths in the West and 53 incidents last year. Of increasing and ongoing concern is the increasing number of lone wolf attacks and also the increased participation of minors in terrorist incidences. So 40% of terrorist investigations in the West incorporated minors last year. In the case of France, for example, 20% of terrorist attacks now incorporated minors. And in the UK, there were 80 minors arrested for terrorism offences last year compared to a dozen 5 years ago. Now, it should be put in context as well. The West really represents a very small sliver of all of the terrorism that we're seeing around the world. So if you take, for example, Pakistan, which was the country most impacted by terrorism last year, it had 20 times higher number of deaths compared to North America, Europe, Australia, and all of the Western countries combined. So it's had over 1,000 deaths each year for the last couple of years now, and overtook Burkina Faso as the country most impacted by terrorism. That's driven by groups like, for example, the Taliban in Pakistan, but also the Islamic State. The Islamic State was notably active in Nigeria this year, which is the country that deteriorated most, both in terms of the number of deaths and number of incidences as well. The Nigeria is within or touches upon the Sahel, which continues to be the epicenter of terrorism around the world, primarily driven by terrorism in Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger. Curiously, we saw a reduction in both deaths and incidences in those 3 countries this year. Rather than the beginning of a new trend, we see this really as a solidification. So the main group operating in that area is Jnim, which is an al-Qaeda affiliate, had been in conflict with the state and with different factions within the Islamic State. over the last couple of years, but have solidified enough terrain in many ways to be able to start carving out a geographical caliphate and start to close a lot of the supply lines, a lot of the infrastructure feeding the major cities. So although we've seen a reduction in incidences there, we do expect there to be an increase. One of the characteristics that we do a deep dive on in the Global Global Terrorism Index this year is around terrorist groups operating what we call borderlands. We see 64% of all terrorist incidents around the world happen within 100 kilometers of a border. Now, that's for a number of different reasons. It can be, for example, the ability to be able to smuggle arms and resources across the border, the ability to melt away across a border, for example. The legacy of colonialism, carving artificial borders through different ethnic groups. Also, natural borders as well tend to have or be constituted by forests, by mountainous areas, which are prime areas for terrorist groups to be able to operate. So if we look at some of the countries that we talked about before, including the Afghanistan-Pakistan border, this tri-state border within Mali, Niger, Burkina Faso, the Lake Chad Basin, and the Democratic Republic of the Congo, we see these primarily around border areas, including Colombia, for example, which is within now the 10 most impacted countries of terrorism in the world. The last time it occupied that spot was in 2012. Interestingly, in Colombia, it's seen the largest number of deaths this year from terrorism since the inception of the Global Peace Index, and that's prior to the signing of the peace agreement with the FARC and the ELN there. In closing, I'd probably be remiss if I didn't talk very briefly about the Iran war and the potential risk that we see there. So there's three core factors. Number one, the increasing the freedom with which Iran-backed militias across Iraq, across Lebanon, Yemen, and other places are operating. Secondly, the possibility of different individuals and small groups operating either inspired or enraged by the conflict in Iran right here in the West, and we've seen that increasingly in the United States in the Austin Bar attack, also right here in Canada with the recent gun attack on a gym in Toronto. And aspects related to that. And then thirdly, just purely instability within Iran. As you see an unstable regime, as you see increased conflict, there are separatist groups within the country, there are ethnic factions within the country who may be vying for power or alternatively may increasingly become marginalized as well. So in closing, over 5,500 deaths from terrorism last year, nearly 3,000, incidences of terrorism as well. Although we saw those top-line reductions, we do see that given the amount of geopolitical conflict that we are seeing around the world, terrorism will continue to feature within the social fabric, not only next year, but for a number of years to come. So with that, I'd love to be able to hand it over to my colleague Phil Gurski for more context.
Good morning. Bonjour à tous et à toutes. My name is Phil Gurski. I am a fellow at the Montreal Institute for Global Security, as well as a former counterterrorism analyst for the Canadian Security Intelligence Service. First and foremost, I want to commend Michael and his team at GTI, Global Institute for Economics and Peace, for an amazing report. I tell people that from an open source perspective, as an old Intel hand, that the GTI is simply the best single source of open source data for terrorism internationally. I read it religiously when it comes out every year, and it didn't disappoint again this year. A couple of very brief points. The report does demonstrate yet again that one particular form of terrorism, which we call Islamist terrorism or jihadist terrorism, is by far the predominant form of terrorism globally. It has been since the inception of the Global Terrorism Index in 2014, and I see no reason to speculate as to whether that will change in 2027 going forward. This is a particular form of terrorism that has present in a lot of countries around the world. And as I said, it shows no signs of ebbing. I want to reiterate what Michael said about current conflict zones. As both Kyle and Michael mentioned, we are seeing an increasing worry about the after effects of what's happening, not just in Iran, but in Gaza and in southern Lebanon, as perhaps feeding terrorism here in Canada. We are a country of diasporas. We are a country where people do still have strong feelings of what's happening back home. And we may be seen by certain terrorist groups as being potentially some easy targets to hit. We saw the attack on the U.S. consulate in Toronto a couple of weeks ago, as well as attacks on Jewish synagogues and schools in the Greater Toronto area and elsewhere in Canada. I guess we here as Canadians, thankfully, do not experience terrorism on a regular basis as some countries in the world that Michael referred to, the Sahel being the epicenter of terrorism. But at the same time, we can't be asleep at the possibility that it will in fact happen here. I'm confident that my former colleagues at CSIS, as well as my friends at the RCMP, are actively engaged in investigations to stop terrorist attacks from happening. But for me, what the GTI brings home is that what happens outside of Canada has an impact within Canada. And I think that Canadians should be aware of that, not panic. Like I said, we have our agencies in place to do this, but to not ignore the fact that events very far from our country could in fact lead to events here in Canada. Thank you.
And for those of you who want to get more information, the Global Terrorism Index for 2026 is on the website of the Institute for Economics and Peace or Vision for Humanity. So I said those who want more information, you can find that there. And if there are any journalists that are online or in person that have questions for any of the speakers today, we're more than willing to take questions.
Yeah, I'd like to ask a question. Thank you for the report. I'm Jillian Piper with Global News. The report talks a little bit about youth radicalization, particularly that being increasingly easier and faster to do online. Canada did see earlier this year one of the worst mass shootings in Canada's history, and that was thought to be a youth that was radicalized online. Are you confident that Canada has the tools necessary to combat quicker timelines for radicalizing young people?
I'll give some comments and I'll pass to Michael and Phil. I think Canada's seen youth radicalization as a serious problem. We saw a number of young Canadians who were recruited online, radicalized, and went to Iraq and Syria to join ISIS, commit atrocities there against minority groups. So we have a history of this happening in our country. The government of Quebec and UNESCO held a major forum, I believe in 2016, on youth radicalization on the internet. So we began to look into the space. One problems we have is the large tech platforms have cut off their human rights teams. They've cut off content moderators, and they've also cut off their looking at dangerous organizations. So there's a concern that the private sector, big tech in the U.S. is not doing their job on this front. And it's very difficult for governments to kind of legislate because we've seen a reaction by the U.S. government to any regulation of online dangers as being seen as censorship, which I disagree with. But there needs more to be done. And we also have to look as well as Chinese social media platforms. They've been a source of radicalization, particularly around the Israel-Gaza war, and also anti-Semitic conspiracy theories that sometimes can lead to violence or to terrorism. So I think we need to be working more on this and do more research, but I'd let my colleagues, maybe Michael, if you'd like to talk about youth radicalization.
Yeah, I mean, maybe just to note that in all of the conversations that we've been having, it's definitely be a reoccurring theme, and it is increasingly a challenge for the intelligence community and law enforcement in many ways. I mean, they're leveraging the most recent tools, but the fundamentals are that the nature of terrorism and extremism has shifted from largely group-based activities to lone wolf actors, which are inherently a lot more difficult to be able to intercept because you no longer have those established communications channels. You no longer have those networks that you can try and get into. You no longer have the financial flows that you were once able to track down to be able to get to those underlying sources. Another additional concern that I think is shared by everyone is that increasingly there's not a concrete ideology either, which makes it even more difficult to be able to intercept. It's a mix of ideologies, and also the broader aspect of, a lot of this is perhaps less to the point in which it is less ideologically driven and it's more just driven around a fascination of violence, right, or a heightening of violence. In the report this year, there's an expert contribution from Julie Chernov that really speaks to a number of the different forums that are online, which is basically simply a glorification of violence for violence's sake. And that continues to be an increasing trend, not only in the West, but I think around the world as well.
You mentioned the mass shooting in Tumbler Ridge, British Columbia. I should point out that according to the Global Terrorism Index, that would not qualify as an act of terrorism. There was no ideology behind it. It was simply, as Michael said, somebody who glorified violence for the sake of violence. So I would caution not trying to mix too many things into this salad. A lot of forms of violence are simply violence, misogyny, whatever, nihilism, which I don't consider to be ideological either. With respect to youth radicalization, it's also not a new phenomenon. I go back to my time at CSIS with the Toronto 18. I mean, 5 of the 18 who were arrested were young offenders under their criminal code. So we've been dealing with this for a very, very long time. There's no question that young people, I think, are more open to ideas because of their cognitive lack of maturity. But I would also want to stress as well, and this is based on my experience, that the vast majority of people who do go online and do express ideas that are hateful or ideological in nature never actually act on those ideas. And the challenge for CSIS, the RCMP, and law enforcement is to narrow down, well, what do you think is the most likely scenario here? Because you don't have resources, nor should you be monitoring everybody online. Are there any ways to pick out those, what I would call those who walk the walk versus those that just talk the talk? And that's, I think, a challenge that we've been facing for quite some time. There's no question that from a group perspective, of course, you want to use minors for a couple of reasons. A, as I said, they're more easily to influence. Secondly, they get lighter sentences under criminal codes. So they can also serve as proxy actors in some way. But there certainly is, as Michael pointed out, especially in places like France, you're seeing an uptick in the use of minors or minors that, I wouldn't say spontaneously, but do decide to engage in acts of terrorism. And it is something that obviously has impacts not just for law enforcement, security, intelligence, but I would argue for society in general. And how do you deal with that?
Thank you. And if I could just ask a follow-up question.
Sure.
You referenced earlier Chinese social media as being a platform that can be used to sort of radicalize individuals or perhaps see conspiracy theories. The government did a national security review of TikTok, and it ultimately allowed it to keep operating in Canada. Would you want to see a bigger clampdown on which kinds of applications can be used in Canada?
Well, I think a lot of the concerns about TikTok were from national security about data being used and kept by China and then used for future influence operations. However, there is some research that's being said that there have been state-sponsored campaigns from Qatar on TikTok to influence youth in Canada, to portray the Israel-Gaza war in very simplest terms, no nuance. And to radicalize Canadian youth to not want to see a peace settlement between both, but to actually side for one to destroy the other. So I think we need to be looking into these cases. If we do see them taking place, we should have strong conversations with not just big tech in the United States, but also some of these Chinese apps, including some of the AI powered apps like their ChatGPT equivalents. Anybody else would like to come?
Just very quickly, this is part of a bigger issue of disinformation online. And as Kyle just said, a lot of AI generated disinformation. This is a much bigger issue than just radicalization and violence per se. I don't think anybody has a magic bullet to try to figure this thing out. It seems to certainly be getting worse. I would agree with Kyle. I do think that the platforms themselves should have they certainly have a moral responsibility. If they identify misinformation or information that may be promoting violence, to remove it. The fact that they've removed their content moderation is very, very worrisome. Should the government put more pressure on the providers? Absolutely. But as Kyle said, we're now in an environment where if you do so, then you invite criticism from certain parties as saying that you are infringing on freedom of speech and freedom of expression. So it's one of these muddy areas that I think we have to try to figure out better. But there's no question that it is having an impact.
Maybe just to add, the Institute for Economics and Peace, we're an Australian think tank, and as you may know, we're kind of sort of one of the countries that really sort of went ahead with the social media ban. You know, I think there are different internal views within IEP, but if you ask anyone with children in IEP, I think for the most part they're very, very supportive of that social media ban. Now, to the extent at which that should be extended to other countries, I mean, that's down to context and down to needs. Maybe I'd just highlight one additional thing. You know, it's perhaps less about ownership, and it's just about more the funnel almost. That social media creates. So, you know, you start with an algorithm that if you are already excited by or alternatively interested in violence, it already leads you down to more extremist routes. That then kind of sort of corrals you into a space where there are people who, you know, think like you and progressively are more extremist as you go down that rabbit hole. That then moves to, you know, the private encryption where there is a lot more grooming, which then leads to that, you know, the attacks. But the underlying feature in that respect there is that a lot of terrorist incidents and acts are committed, yes, by youth, but by youth that have histories of neglect and abuse. So I think one of the core factors there is, while we can continue to kind of sort of talk about social media bans and how we should go about countering that in the digital sphere, there are fundamentals there that we can still work to address as a society, for sure.
Okay, well, I guess I'll keep going then. I had a few other points specifically about Canada. You mentioned in the report that Canada recorded 0 terrorist incidents in 2025. I believe that was the first time in the index series. If you might want to expand on that finding, and just maybe how rare that is for a country to have 0, particularly after, if you think that will be a trend that continues. I know in the report it says it doesn't think so. Why do you believe that?
So the report itself has a cutoff date of December 2025. So Phil and Kyle both referred to a couple of instances that we saw at the beginning of the year that may count towards, the terrorist score, for lack of a better word, in Canada next year. Broadly, the assessment is based on risks that we're seeing within the West as a whole and how that may impact Canada. Historically, though, Canada is not only an extremely peaceful nation, but also has very little instances of terrorism. I should say that our definition of terrorism is quite conservative in that sense. So some of the things that may be discussed as a terrorist attack in certain instances, may not be included within the Global Terrorism Index. Hopefully, one of the key values of the Global Terrorism Index, despite the fact that the definition of terrorism changes depending where you are, is that it provides that standardized measure over time, keeping that very core conservative definition of terrorism, which enables us to be able to sort of, be more confident in the kinds of trends that we predict, including that one.
If I may, in 2022, I published The Peaceable Kingdom, which looks at terrorism in Canada dating back to Confederation. And as Michael said, we are a largely peaceable nation with very few acts of terrorism since, in the past 160 years. One of the issues I think that's complicating things is I really appreciate that the Global Terrorism Index has a very conservative definition of terrorism. I have found in recent years in Canada it's been much more liberal, where incidents which I would classify as acts of violence or perhaps hate crimes are now being reclassified as terrorism. A prime example for me is the killings in London, Ontario, which happens to be my hometown, where 4 Muslims were killed and one was injured by a supposed right-wing extremist. To me, that strikes me as a hate crime, even though the Crown elected to go with terrorism charges and he was found guilty on terrorism. But I do think if you look at Canada historically, we have been blessed in that we haven't had the levels of terrorism that many of our Western partners have. And to give you a very concrete example, when I worked at CSIS, at any given time, I can't give you specifics, but we would be concerned about a couple hundred people a year from an investigative perspective. The French Security Service has more than 18,000 people of interest. MI5, and these are public figures, MI5 has 23,000 people of interest on their list. That indicates that's several orders of magnitude greater than we have here in Canada. And we can talk for eons as to why that is. But I think that historically Canada has been seen as a country that is not immune from terrorism, but is, compared to our closest Western allies, is in a much better position for reasons that are much too complicated to explain here.
And just maybe one closing comment, and it's wonderful and it's great for the Canadian authorities that have prevented terrorist attacks in 2025. We did have a considerable number of people that were stopped before they were able to carry it out. So yes, we didn't have any deadly incidents, but we did have a lot of people that were planning to do so. Kudos to the authorities that were able to catch that and work with our partners of getting that intelligence early to protect Canadians from such violence.
Question. Thank you for indulging me, but we talked a little bit about how to combat, some of the difficulties in targeting radicalization online, trying to sort of tamper that down. But are there other measures that you think either the Canadian government or other officials in Canada could be doing to sort of perhaps decrease the level of terrorism or perhaps stop it earlier in its tracks? Is there anything you think could help in terms of Canada's response to terrorism?
I'll let Phil answer this one.
Obviously, resources. If you're with CSIS or with the RCMP, you never have enough bodies to do the investigations that are required. identifying it early on obviously is better. One thing that we did very successfully in the mid-2010s was we went across Canada and talked about radicalization with communities and said these are problematic behaviors that you need to be aware of. And we found that was well received, whether they were religious communities, ethnic communities, average communities. Knowledge is power. And I think if Canadians get a better sense as to what is behavior or ideology or thinking that may in fact lead to violence, the sooner they realize that, the better. You look at, like, Tumble Ridge would be a good example, right? That young person's activity online, had it been flagged earlier, that attack may, and I stress may, have been prevented if somebody had intervened at a certain point. As intelligence services, obviously, it's very difficult for them to disclose the information, but I think that dialogue needs to continue where we share what we know without getting into active investigations so that people have that information in advance, that when they do detect these individuals, they, first of all, they recognize it for what it is, and perhaps most importantly, they know whom to call. Is this something you call your local law enforcement about? Is this something you call a health provider about? Is this something you call the security service about? Without that information, people are left, well, and I have this from personal experience, I didn't know it was problematic. I didn't know that what my son, daughter, father, uncle, cousin was going through would have led to this particular type of incident. After the fact, I now see it. So having that information earlier is something that could be used to possibly prevent the types of violence that you're talking about.
And I don't know if there are any other questions from our colleague from Global News or anyone online. Yes. So thank you very much. And once again, the Global Terrorism Index is on the website of the Institutes for Economic and Peace. Thank you.
Thank you. You're welcome.